As we saw in the previous lesson, there's a component there is nearly in all game objects of Unity, and that component is called transform. So there are three things we can deal with the transform. We can deal with position, rotation, and also scale. So let's take a look on here. Notice that if you select a camera, let's also double click and zoom with the mouse wheel to check the main camera closer. If we change any of these values that we see here on X, Y, and Z, this icon is going to move. You can change the value on X by either just typing a number in here, like 1, or 2, or 3, and the camera is going to slowly move. Or you can also click on the label X, or Y, or Z, and move the camera around. Okay, so what is this telling us? Notice that when we use X, we are moving the camera, so we are moving this game object in 1 degree of freedom, in one axis. And this axis is called the horizontal axis, which is this red arrow here. You can even click on this arrow and move the camera around so you can fine-tune the position for this camera, okay? And this is very good for visual editing. So if you have buildings, if you have cars, if you have some trees in this game, you can just use this arrow to move the camera horizontally, okay? And if you notice here at this gizmo in the top right of the scene window, there's a little hint that this is the x-axis, the horizontal one. So it's the red arrow, okay? Now, if we go to Y and change that, you notice that the camera is moving up and down. This is the vertical axis. Okay, so right now we've tested 2 degrees of freedom, the horizontal and the vertical axis, which is basically allowing us to put the camera in a 2D environment. However, for 3D elements, for 3D games, we have a third degree, okay? That's why it's 3D, we have 3 dimensions. And this third degree is the Z-axis, which is the depth axis. Okay, sometimes in other engines, this Z and Y are swapped. Okay, so Z would be the vertical axis and Y would be the depth axis. But for Unity, X and Y are horizontal and vertical, and Z is the actual one that gives depth, okay, which I personally think is better. It makes more sense. Okay, so Z is used for moving in this axis of freedom here, and it is the blue arrow. Okay, and well, with these 3 numbers, we can position this game object in whatever we want. Now, what if we want to deal with 2 axes at the same time? Okay, we can see that these arrows that we see here in the scene window can be clicked and dragged. Okay, so we can move on X, Y, X, Z, and Y. But if you look closer here, there are 3 cubes in this camera. Okay, if you click on the green camera, if you click on the green cube, you can move the camera in the XZ plane. Okay, so horizontal and depth. This color here is directly opposite to the axis that, well, it's coming out of it. Okay, so if you use this green one, you move on blue and red. If you use the red cube, you move on green and blue, and if you use the blue cube, you move on green and red. So this is very good for positioning things in a plane. So imagine we had a plane in here and we had a building, for example, and we had to reposition that building. Instead of trying to manually selecting these numbers, we can just click on the green cube and position this building around the scene, for example. We're going to practice this shortly. Okay, so this is pretty much it for position. We also have rotation, and it works more or less the same way. We have 3 degrees of movement here, X, Y, and Z. And well, if we change X, notice that we are using the camera to look up or down. And you can immediately see how this rotation is changing by looking at these gray lines that come out of the camera, or by looking at the camera preview. Okay, you can use both to see how this is impacting. If we use Y, we make the camera rotate in the vertical axis. Okay, so we are able to look to the left or to the right, for example, like this. Okay, and if we go to Z, it's going to make the camera rotate sideways. Okay, so you can, well, it's like you're tilting your head to the left or to the right. But there's another way to change the rotation. Okay, so right now we have these arrows that change the position. However, if you go to the top left of Unity, there are a few tools available for you here. Okay, so the second one that is pre-selected by default is the moving tool. Okay, so we can, well, do all this movement. The first one is basically for moving our developer camera. Okay, so we can look at other places, but well, if we use the right mouse button, we can just navigate around much better. But still, it's good to know that this exists. Now, if we click on the third camera, notice that the tools around this main camera are different. Okay, so we have a red circle, a green circle, and a blue circle. And if we click and drag them around, well, we can rotate the camera on all of these three axes. And it works the same way. Red is for X, green is for Y, and blue is for Z. Okay, so you can just click and move around so we're able to fine tune the camera to look to whatever position we want, okay, in whatever manner we want. And if you click on this sphere around the camera, you're able to freely rotate this, but in general it's not very useful. It's a bit difficult to rotate the camera like this. It's better to just select some degrees and well, calmly choose the better values that you want. Okay. And the third element is the scale. Okay, so scale is basically changing the size of things. We have X, Y, and Z. However, if we change the scale in the camera on X, Y, and Z, notice that absolutely nothing seems to happen. Okay, the scale is not changing. The camera is not getting any bigger. You have to remember that this camera that we see here, this little icon is, well, it's not inside the game. This is just a representation, a tip that help us to click on the camera and select the camera and know where the camera is. Same goes for light, but they are abstract. Okay, they are not a 3D model. They're not an actual camera model that a player is going to see that there's a camera following them. That's not how it works. Okay, so to deal with scale, we have to deal with a 3D element. Okay, so how do we make a 3D element? We need to make what we call a 3D primitive. If we want complex 3D elements, it's better to design them in other tools like 3D Max, Maya, or Blender, and then you import to Unity, because Unity is not a 3D modeling and texturing tool. Okay, it's a game making tool. But sometimes we can use some primitive shapes to, well, we can prototype the game without needing to have the final art, which is good. So if you prototype your entire game with simple shapes like cubes, spheres, cylinders, and cones, you're able to do two things. You can program your game, so you're not waiting on anything to be ready, and you can also adjust the game design of your game, so you can find the difficulty that you want. Okay, you can find the experience that you want to pass to the players. So how do we make a 3D element? If we go to our hierarchy and then we right click here, you're going to see there is a new menu. So we have copy, paste, duplicate, delete, but down here we have several other options. We can create some nice game objects in here. We can create an empty game object, which is going to be, well, it's just going to have a transform component. Okay, so let's go ahead. If you click on create empty, there's going to be game object, and it just contains transform. That's not what we want. Now, if you take a look, there are some other menus here. We have 2D, 3D object, 2D object, light, audio, UI, particle system, and camera. We're going to 3D object, and you're going to see that there are some familiar names in here. We have cube, sphere, capsule, cylinder, and we also have plane. Okay. To start, let's click on cube, okay, which is the most basic shape. So we have a cube element in the hierarchy. Okay, we have the cube game object. And if you go to the inspector, you notice that there are lots of components in this cube. Let's take a look at them one by one. Okay, so first of all, the one that we are basically, this is basically everything we're talking about in this lesson, is the transform component. So we have the position, and it's set to an odd number. If we want to move this cube to the center of the scene, we can just change X to 0, Y to 0, and Z to 0. So the cube is right here. Okay, this is the origin of our scene. It's the middle of our scene. And we also, well, just like the camera, we have rotation. If we change rotation on X, the cube flips to these sides, okay? And we also have scale, and this is where scale is going to make things interesting. If we change scale on X, the cube is going to increase its size in the horizontal axis, okay? So we can use a large number for X to make it bigger, or we can use a small number, even a smaller than one, to make it look shorter like this. We could even use a negative number to flip it horizontally, but well, there's no difference for this cube. We can do the same thing vertically to make the cube taller or shorter, and in the depth axis as well. Okay, so we can use all of these 3 degrees, 3 axes, 3 dimensions to change the scale and then change the size of the cube. But if we want to do this visually, we can use a tool for that. We can just go to this resizing tool. And you notice that if we are in the moving tool, we have some arrows. But if you go to this scaling tool, you're going to see some cubes, okay, which is a little tip that it means we're going to resize whatever we have selected. We're going to change the scale. If you use red, it changes horizontally, green vertically, and blue in the depth axis. And if you use this middle cube here, and this is very good, you can scale on 3 axes at the same time. And this is very good to keep proportion. Okay, so if we made a cube like this one, for example, and we want to keep the proportion between the scale, okay, all of these properties here, we can just use this blue cube, and we're going to change them to change everything properly. Okay, it's like, remember when you used to draw in paint, for example, and you just resized an image, but you made the image look a bit flat, okay, a bit weird. That's pretty much the solution to that. Okay, if you work on 3 degrees at the same time for scaling, you are going to preserve proportion, which is going to make the game look prettier that way. Okay. And this cube game object contains several components inside it. So we have the cube mesh filter. Okay, so this is basically the data for the 3D object that is being rendered here, 3D mesh. We have a box collider, which is used for basically processing collisions. So if we activate physics later, this is going to be used. And we also have a mesh render. Okay, now this component is very important because notice that if we disable it, the cube is completely invisible now. But if we keep it enabled, well, we can see the cube again. Okay, so this basically draws the cube. Let's talk about this in more details in the next lesson.